Hey everyone, Azo here again and welcome to the second part of my guide to playing the French defense as black. If you haven't seen the first part yet, feel free to check it out in the video description. For part 2, we're going to explore the exchange variation. Generally speaking, it's played by those who want to play for a draw in a very simple and symmetrical position. So if you are also satisfied with half a point, then you can go for almost any natural and generic setup. And it's not very difficult to earn a draw from someone who isn't trying to win. So this video will focus on two other critical things in the exchange variation. One, if white is ambitious and actually tries to win with c4 here. And more importantly, two, if white plays non-c4 setups and you don't want to draw, if you want to imbalance the game and play for the full point. So, before I begin, I want to again emphasize that, as with all my opening videos, the focus isn't going to be on theory, but rather just some key ideas. So for the games I've selected to show here, they are played by humans and won't be perfect, but the important thing is that they demonstrate a good understanding of the position's objectives. So let's start examining c4 here. Why do I say this is a sign white is ambitious? Because these two pawns will almost certainly trade at some point. When that happens, white will be left with an isolated queen pawn, thereby creating an imbalance. White has more space, but has a worse pawn structure from an endgame perspective. So how do we play against an isolated queen pawn, otherwise known as the IQP by many experienced players? It's all about knowing both sides' strengths and weaknesses. As I mentioned, if I remove these two pawns for demonstration purposes, white has a space advantage, which is especially useful in the middle game, where having some extra control over a good square, like e5, would mean that white has decent attacking prospects. On the flip side, black will have a favorable endgame should the game reach that stage, because the attacking possibilities will drop to nearly zero, and the d4 pawn will simply be a hassle to defend. But black's advantage is not limited to somewhat elusive long-term aspects. Even during the middle game, black has a great outpost already, the d5 square. And that's another key disadvantage of having an isolated pawn. The square in front of it is also weaker because no white pawn can control it. And while d5 may not be as central or invasive as e5, the e5 square isn't really a proper outpost because black has the option of kicking it with f6, albeit at the cost of weakening the position slightly. That is effectively all the fundamentals of the IQP in theory, so I'm going to leave you with one out of many good representations of black's ideal position. Here, many pieces have been traded, except a pair of queens and rooks. So white has insufficient firepower for a king hunt, but black has enough pieces to meaningfully pressure d4. Additionally, there's a pin here, and black has occupied the d5 outpost. And so, he'll be able to win material with c5 in the next move. And this is all thanks to black first removing white's dynamic counterplay by trading away all the minor pieces. So with this in mind, we'll look at the first game of the video, Draguluk Velimirovich as white against Wolfgang Ullmann with the black pieces. We have a different move order, but it transposes back eventually. And once it transposes back, you'll notice that the tension is held between these two pawns for quite some time. This is because whoever relieves the pressure will concede the d5 square to a small extent. If black takes, white will have good control over d5, and if white takes, black will immediately use that square. The tension is maintained until the 8th move, bishop d3, and that's when black decided it was time to take the pawn, since white will have to spend a second move on the bishop to make the recapture. Additionally, now with black's improved control over the d5 square, there's no stopping knight d7 to b6 to d5. And this is a huge strategic victory, and what's black's general plan from here? That's right, it's to complete development, then trade pieces, especially minor pieces. So that's exactly what Ullmann played. He brought out all his pieces, maintaining firm control over d5 at all times, then encouraged some piece trades with bishop b4. And eventually, it came to a point where white had to either trade the queens and allow the endgame, which would be favorable for black, or try to complicate matters with bishop takes f6, which happened in the game. But black had it fully worked out, and when g takes f6, now both the knight and the rook are hanging, so white had to play queen takes f6 to save the knight and threaten perpetual check. But simply rook d6, and now both the queen and the rook are hanging. And the point is that queen g5 can be met with rook g6 thanks to the pin. So, instead of queen g5, the game ended with knight d7 and bishop takes e1, where black is up an entire rook for just one pawn, so white resigned. I can show you another example of strong play against the IQP by Nicolas Sedlec, and the idea is very similar. Develop rapidly and trade minor pieces. So bishop e7 to prepare knight takes d5, and later bishop g4 so that some piece trade will happen on this diagonal sooner or later. Going ahead a few more moves, I should also mention that Sedlec was in no rush to take this d5 pawn because it's usually indefensible anyway with rook coming to d8. After a couple more moves, we reach a position where the king side was blocked and the third set of minor pieces were traded, and it becomes apparent that white's d4 pawn isn't serving him very well, so white has no concrete attack to speak of. White decided to push d5 to stop knight d5, but now the pawn is even harder to defend. Eventually, the pawn fell, and the rooks were traded, and shortly after, the queens were traded, and we enter a knight endgame, which black managed to convert. Finally, I'm going to move on to the last example of how to deal with the IQP, which will highlight the importance of kingside development speed and one key move, bishop b4 check. Technically, it doesn't put you ahead in overall development, but you do develop a kingside piece while forcing white to spend time on a queenside piece. And this is important because the e-file is fully open and both sides need to castle as early as they can. As a general rule, if one side is 2.5 tempi ahead in kingside development in such a position, the opponent should be in trouble. Let me demonstrate that. Here, straight after the pawn trade, white is up half a move. After c4, white has sort of wasted a move, so now black is the one ahead half a tempo. After bishop b4 check and knight c3, black will be up 1.5 tempi on the king side, which still isn't enough to cause any serious problems, because even if black times his capture on c4 correctly, such that the bishop needs to move twice, and goes rook e8, white has bishop e3 and is ready to castle next move. And black doesn't have knight g4 here because of the tactical issues surrounding f7 and the unprotected b4 bishop. So bishop takes f7 right now is possible, but it is even stronger to get the king off the e-file first. And if black were to take this pawn, white will have a decisive advantage after bishop takes f7, and while queen b3 is good enough, knight e5 is even stronger, and black's king will not survive. However, if, in addition to c4, white had wasted another move, say h3, then black will have the advantage, as we'll see from the game Rabinovich-Abram playing white against Mises Jack playing black. They reached this very position by a different move order, and instead of bishop e2, Abram played bishop e3 and then h3 to stop knight g4. But now, thanks to h3, we can say that black is ahead 2.5 tempi in kingside development, and now comes a strong attack. Knight e4 hitting c3, followed by queen e7, not just to defend the b4 bishop, but to threaten knight takes f2 and crash on e3. So white had to castle long, which isn't a good sign since the c-file is going to open while the d-file is going to remain closed. And this advantage alone was enough for Jack to win, thanks to moves like knight takes c3, reminding white that the knight is taboo on pain of rook c8, and later on in a couple of moves, white got his queen trapped, and the game was over by move 23. So that was about the strategy against the IQP. The long-term ideas are to trade minor pieces and control the outposts in front of the IQP, that is, the d5 square. The short-term ideas are to delay the capture on c4, so that while you spend a second move on the d-pawn, the light square bishop will likewise need to play a second move to recapture. And final point, the speed of your kingside development is important. If you're ahead 2.5 tempi in that area of the board, you should be doing well, and bishop b4 is a helpful move to give you that speed. Now we move on to how to spice the position if white doesn't go c4 and plays for the draw. I'll give two suggestions. The first is to take the IQP yourself by playing c5. However, the thing about that is that you're already down half a tempo as black, and if you neglect your kingside development for yet another move with c5, you can't afford to allow white bishop b5 check, where white will be up 2.5 tempi on the kingside, and you can expect to suffer the same fate as white in the previous game, but this time you don't even have the semi-useful h6 move, whereas in the Abram Jack game we saw, white had h3. Therefore, it's only safe to play c5 when white has committed to the development of his light square bishop. So bishop b5 doesn't have the same impact that it had. And now your strategy should be the opposite of everything we discussed when playing against the IQP. You should now keep pieces on the board, attack fiercely, and ensure white doesn't gain too much control over d4. One of the best examples of an attacking game with the IQP is by the great Viktor Korchnoi, who played black in this position against Stefano Tatai, an international master. The game was played back in 1978. Tatai didn't bother with c3, nor did Korchnoi care about c4, which merely creates a rather meaningless queenside spatial advantage, which can be undermined with b3. Anyway, Tatai used a strategy of delaying the capture on c5 until the dark square bishop has moved, and then went h3, because this spin can be rather annoying without bishop e2 to break it. Both sides castled, black took on c5, and white went c3 to control d4, preparing the long-term plan of bringing the knight to d4. However, white has a short-term issue, and that is his development. In particular, h3 was slow, and queen e2 allows rook e8 to come with tempo. White went queen c2, and now I'd like you to pause the video and find a way for Korchnoi to convert this promising position. Alright, the idea is queen d6 to g3. And here's where the space advantage counts. Without white's pawn on d4, this bishop is free to pin the f2 pawn so that this queen can invade to g3. Also, having the c6 square vacant allows the knight to use that square, its most active square, rather than d7, which means that this light square bishop can join the party very quickly. Tatai had to stop bishop takes h3 with bishop f5, but more attackers invaded anyway, and since f2 is indefensible, white lost in just 19 moves. So that was about playing with the IQP, and I'm going to offer one more suggestion to imbalance the position, an idea used by the great Alexander Alekhine, best demonstrated with the following game, Moshe Eliashiv playing white against Alekhine with black. Here's the setup. You can mix the move orders a bit if you like. You go knight c6, bishop d6, bishop g4, and now the most distinct characteristic of Alekhine's setup, knight g to e7. This imbalances the game in a sound way, and there are a couple of merits to this slightly odd looking development scheme. 1. You can easily challenge white's good light square bishop in the future. 2. Knight e7 keeps the open file closed, so you have time to castle queenside, and castling opposite sides will encourage a sharp and interesting game. Finally, to help with the kingside attack, your knights can find their way to f4. So let's see how the game continued. Alekhine got the long castle, and Eliashiv went queen a4 to attack a7 and prepare b4 and b5. However, this walks into the line of fire of black's queen, So if Alekhine wished, he could have played king b8. Not so much to defend a7, but to stop b4. And the idea is that now, black has knight takes d4, winning a pawn and attacking white's queen. White can take on d7 first, but because this doesn't come with check, black has time to take on f3 first to save the knight, and then regain the queen and will remain up a pawn. But in the game, Alekhine opted to take the open file instead, defended a7 with the king, and retreated his knight to d8. So now both sides have pieces on the first two ranks, but the difference is Alekhine can spring his pieces to life much faster. And this becomes evident just 3 moves later, where black is ready to fight and white still has problems with his coordination. Alekhine was able to land the rook on e1 and then maintain control with queen to e8. And with the pressure on white, he made a blunder, f3. And here you can pause the video if you'd like to find the move for Alekhine. It's queen e3 while the knight is pinned. Then trade the rooks, and then take the bishop. And Alishev resigned here on move 20. So that was about spicing up the exchange French, playing against and with the IQP and Alekhine setup. That's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in part 3.